Welcome to today's session. Today I am going to try and build on the conversation that I started in the prior session where I talked about the importance of being indifferent towards sex, and in many ways also being indifferent towards women you find attractive. And I realized at the end of the prior session that one of the things that I did not provide or I did not touch on was the importance of what your focus should pivot to. In many ways, I had tried to encourage men to pivot their focus from one area, to pivot their energy from one area to another. And so in today's session, I would try to connect both what you're pivoting from to what you're pivoting to. And I think most importantly, I will try to expand on the importance of why. Now, I explained that irrespective of who you are, or where you were born, where you were raised, there is naturally within each man almost a longing, a desire to be applauded, to be acknowledged, to be esteemed, to receive the affection of a woman, whether that be our mothers, our big sisters, our wives, our girlfriends, or the women in society in general. In every man, there is always this longing to be recognized and accepted. Even sometimes when we are not sexually involved with the woman in question or with the women in question, innate in our being, our core, is the recognition of the importance women play, the role women play in a man's life. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. However, over the last, say, 60, 70 years, we've seen that the male image, manhood, masculinity has been under some tremendous, severe attack to the extent that most men do not really know what it means to be a man. Today we look to women for approval, for recognition, and in part most of that has come because most young men today are being raised without fathers. No fathers or good fathers in the family, and an absence of good men in the community. And so the only thing we really know is, or we've been exposed to in the general, has been the female image, what it means to be a supporting mother, a supporting teacher who is a female, a supporting female role model, because there's been very few male role models, especially during the early stages of a young man's life. When you go through school and college, most of the teachers are female. So the role models we've been exposed to have come from either mothers and our teachers, and we've been conditioned to seek to please a woman. Most young men transfer that energy and that expectation all the way through their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And I made this observation a couple of months ago, and this observation was made across different demographics and different age groups. In any case, I came to the realization that there was an important need for men to start to become slightly more focused on themselves, on who they want to be, who they should be, their goals, their dreams, having a vision for their lives. Because I observed that amongst especially men between the age group of 18 and 35, the focus on sex and the focus on getting a woman's approval in order to be able to gain some form of sexual invitation was out of proportion, and the focus was just a little bit too much. Now let me qualify today's session by making a broad generalization or statement in relation to the advice I usually provide, and that is that there are three groups of men that I hope to reach. The first group I call the pre-school group, and that deals with men who are pre-college, ages as young as you can, all the way up to about 18 years. The second group is my main focus group, which is between 18 and 35, and there is the final group, which is from 35 and above. In many ways, those who are in the first group are still very effectively, they're not men yet, they're still very young. The second group are going through manhood and coming into themselves, and the last group of men, I haven't actually started to talk to the last group because most men in that group, I would hope, already know what to do. So when I speak, I'm primarily speaking to men between the age of 18 and 35, although today's session will apply across all age groups. Let's start today's session by, I guess, me making a few. I'll try to cover about 4 or 5, and if I have time, I might cover a few more. But let me speak to about 4 or 5 very important points. The first, each and every one of us as a man, we have 3 parts to our personality. We live in 3, you might call it, levels of understanding: the spiritual, the physical, and the mental. The spiritual, in many ways, is present in every one of us. The one area that we can focus on primarily has to do with the physical and the mental. What we do in relation to how we use our minds influences the physical, and vice versa. And we know that energy just is, and that the same energy that we need to get into a state of creativity is the same energy that can be channeled towards sexuality. So in many ways, when you find people who are overtly sexualized, you also tend to find that such people, obviously there are exceptions, but such people also have very little creativity if they do not control their sexual desires. So in many ways, the condition that I'm trying to instill in most men is the attitude of indifference is to enable you re-channel or pivot the energy you're expending for the purpose of sex, for the purpose of a sexual experience, to channel that energy towards creativity, towards being more focused on your dreams, your goals, your desires, who you want to be in the future, building a life for yourself, and actually focusing that energy back to yourself. Seeing yourself in a much greater light, not focusing on where you are today, but thinking about the potential in you and what you could be should you give yourself the opportunity to become that person. Now, with that said, the second point I would like to make is this: the sex today in the modern West is the new commodity. So the importance we associate with sex, especially men, in my opinion, is way out of proportion. There was a time when, in order for you to have sex, because one of the things that actually motivates men is sex, the desire for sex, the idea that we will be compensated for something we do, whether that be by being influential, by creating wealth, by having power. We believe we then have the opportunity to fulfill our sexual desires. Many years ago, if you go back to the 18th and the 19th century, you couldn't have sex without being married. Today, as a result of the liberalization, especially by feminists, sex is something that has become a commodity. We have deregulated the sexual marketplace to the point whereby sex really has no price, because anyone might be willing to give you what you want, and in exchange they believe they're liberated. Now what this means is, if you think about what a commodity is, you can obtain from whoever is willing to exchange, mutual exchange, what you want for what they also want. We've seen this in relation to a few technological developments. We have sexual or dating apps. I don't really like to call them dating apps, because they're really sexual apps where you can set up an account and you have the opportunity to meet people who come to the same place primarily for casual sex. And what that simply means is that the attention young men are given to sex, the pursuit of sex, the energy, the time, the resources, the opportunity cost being expended on the streets for sex is not necessary, because in the same modern West where we live in, sex is a commodity. You simply have to download one of the apps and swipe left or swipe right, and you can pair bond, you can match with people who are happy to give you what they want, what you want, because you're giving them what they want. Now what this simply means is that if sex has been reduced to the point whereby you don't have to pay for the app, you can connect with people and explicitly make it known that what you want is sex or a casual encounter, and the person accepts your invitation or declines your invitation. And all of that can be done from the comfort of your home with an app you haven't paid for, and with the apps designing in features whereby if the person is game, they can actually take an Uber to your house, which means you've paid nothing for sex. You haven't even gone out on a date, but you are getting sex. You haven't even met the person, perhaps, for coffee, but you are going to get sex. And that simply means most of the time we expend, most young men, pursuing women for sex is grossly inappropriate. Now, the second thing I would like to say is this. I mentioned that it's very important to have an attitude of indifference towards sex. I also mentioned that it's important to have an aura of indifference towards sex. One of the things I didn't mention in the prior session is how you obtain this aura or attitude, and perhaps why it works in your favor, both yours and the woman's. And I thought about perhaps a concept that could illustrate this idea. And for those of you who have actually been to a sushi bar, you've seen that once the chef has prepared the meal, they put the meal on a conveyor belt, and you come into the restaurant and you sit down, and the conveyor belt keeps moving, and you can choose what you want from the options available. As a young man between 18 and 35, and for those of you who are above 35, you should have a variety, in my opinion, of options. And that simply means that you're not, as I have said before, you should not be in a mono relationship. The reason being, 95% of your time should be focused on your vision, your goals, your dreams, creating wealth, becoming your best self, and 5% could be spent on women. That is my recommendation. Now, if you're spending 5% of your time on women, that amounts to roughly 2.5 hours every week. You don't have time for dating, for pursuing women, which simply means you need to sow your wild oats. And see that as the concept of a conveyor belt. 7 days in a week, if you choose to, you can have 7 women and have one every single day. Now, again, this is not a moralistic conversation. I'm not judging your decisions. But here is the point, and this connects to the whole concept of being indifferent. Let's paint a picture of 2 different men. One man has 7 different women who he can have on any other day of the week. And let's say he has one person, a different person every day of the week. I can assure you, he has an attitude of indifference. If he calls the first one and she says, I'm busy, he calls the second one. They say, I'm busy, he calls the third one. The option he has, and access he has to other women, creates a confidence and an attitude of indifference towards sex. On the other hand, let's use the second person, and we'll describe this person for those of you who have either seen or observed what we call the bulldogging, if that concept comes to mind. This is where you have cowboys try to wrestle a mammal to the ground using its horn. And that idea comes to mind when I think of most young men, which is that we have no options. We are trying to wrestle, effectively, we're trying to find the woman and try to wrestle her to the ground. For us, that is our sexual journey. It's quite desperate. And if you don't succeed, sometimes so much damage is done. If you've ever seen bulldogging, so much damage is done, either by the mammal injuring you or you hurting yourself as part of that exercise or that process. You should think of yourself as a conveyor belt, meaning you sit down and you get to choose. Rather than seeing yourself as a cowboy embarking on one of the bulldogging episodes or experiences. Now, this simply means that if you see yourself as a conveyor belt and if you have options, you will have an attitude of indifference towards sex. You will not feel that you have to overtly exert yourself just to get sex. You wouldn't have to go through the expensive and risky bulldogging experience of trying to wrestle one woman to the ground for the purpose of sex. And in the process, you lose your manhood, your ego. You make mistakes. Sometimes you get so desperate. You get so desperate that you forget to hear the word no. Again, this is where I come back to the conveyor belt concept. That if you have 6 or 7 different partners, the word no should be something that comes, that you pick up very quickly. Whereas if you're desperate, if you believe this is the only way you can get sex, by getting her drunk, or getting her into a place where she's no longer safe or comfortable, it's possible to become tone deaf, where you cannot hear the word no. Effectively, you're desperate. And when you're desperate, that's when you do stupid things. So keep that second concept in mind. Now, when you combine the fact that the first concept I mentioned is sex being a commodity, and recognizing that there are willing participants in the market today and who are happy to be in that conveyor belt, not because they want to be pawned on, but because that's the life people are living today. You see yourself as the man sitting, waiting for his sushi, and they see you as the ones who will be sushied. So this is a game of where both parties are playing the same game. Now, the third thing I'd like to talk about is the importance of your purpose and how being in your purpose, having a goal, having an understanding of what your grind should be, can also help you create an attitude of indifference. So the first was, if you have enough options, and if you keep sowing your wild oats, you would have enough to reach out to when you're hungry, then you don't have to act to be in a desperate manner. That is, in many ways, you following the pathway that I mentioned about your energy being focused towards creativity or towards sex. The second option is where you think about using your energy towards your creativity, and this relates to your purpose and your grind. I said that 95% of your energy should always be focused on yourself, your education, your profession, building a great career, developing your human capital, developing enough intelligence so that you can earn a living, so that you can actually create generational wealth or wealth for yourself, so you can actually perhaps buy yourself your first apartment, your first home. All of that connects to your purpose. In many ways, you're trying to find out why you're here on earth and why you were born. That whole journey, we call it your grind. In many ways, I make reference to the fact that if where you are is not your place of purpose, then it's a preparation ground getting you ready for your place of purpose. So whether you're where you should be in a purposeful environment, or whether you're preparing yourself for that place, we call that the grind. And this means that if 95% of your time is focused on the grind, I mean completely focused on your grind, there is no way you would have an aura or an attitude of desperation towards sex. As a matter of fact, think about Bill Gates, or think about Steve Jobs, or think about some of the great entrepreneurs who back in the day could sit down and they could write code for 15 hours and not even think about food. That's how focused they were. You go and get into a flow state whereby everything almost disappears, where your focus is simply on what you're doing. And if you can, and not everyone can, but if you can, make your job the most important part of your life, make your vision, make your dreams, make your goals, become obsessed in many ways with becoming great. If you make that your main focus, you automatically will develop an aura of indifference. Now, in many ways, what that also means is that you have no time for women or for pursuing women, because all of your energy is focused towards creativity. I guess I could say this in a different way. The energy expended in pursuit of something creative is productive, and it compounds and it multiplies. The energy expended towards pursuing sex or for sexual gratification is regressive. It also compounds in the opposite direction. So play the card as you will and as you choose to, but recognize that if you focus 95% of your time on positive, productive energy and 5% on what I might call regressive energy, you will have an aura or an attitude of indifference towards sex. Now let me then move to what I might call point number 3, and I'll connect this to my own experience so you can understand how over the years I've come to see mistakes that I made, but also things that I perhaps could have done differently. If you have an attitude of indifference towards sex, and even towards women generally, it would ensure, and this is point number 3, that you do not break the rules. And you might be thinking, well, he hasn't actually given me the rules, so how can I know what rules to break? I mentioned before that when men go out in a sexual or in a social setting, most of the time we're driven by the need for the female approval, acknowledgements. We're looking to attract the most attractive woman. and in many ways give out the least resources possible. And what we tend to do as men is we think about places where we believe women congregate. Now, over time, that has changed. Today, you still have places like bars, you have clubs, you have good restaurants, and in many ways, you also have places like the gym, and then the virtual locations like social media. Now, I'm referring specifically today to the physical places as opposed to the virtual locations. My observation has been, and here, perhaps I could share some of my experience. Over the course of my 20s and even up to today, I do not go out to bars with the explicit intention of pursuing women. I never did. For many years, I worked too long in terms of working hours. That most of the time when I went to bars, I went there because I was going with friends. So it was more like a pressure release to bond with the boys, to talk about things that we haven't done, to talk about things we are doing, to encourage each other, and sometimes to have a drink. The idea was I was trying to socialize. I wasn't looking for tail. And I guess this is something I would recommend in terms of not breaking the rules, is that you reframe in your mind what you believe these venues are for. A bar is not for picking up women. When you go out to bars, the idea should be to go to socialize. And I back in the day would go out, and if there was a weekend that I was out of the country, I would go to places and I would be alone. And sometimes I just enjoyed going to the bar, sitting down by the bar, striking up a conversations with the bartenders and observing, looking around, just enjoying myself. If I went out with friends, we would hang out together. You know, we never really pursued. You know, we didn't have that what I call we weren't possessed with the need for sex, and that meant that when we went out to have a good time. And there were rules sometimes. Sometimes there were rules whereby none of us was allowed to be distracted or to leave with a woman. And if you met someone you liked, you could exchange numbers. And part of that rule was to say, listen, sometimes when you have too much to drink, men make the most mistakes when they have too much to drink, or when they have, and when they believe that there could be an opportunity for sex with someone they find very attractive. We make the most mistakes. We break all the rules. And so in relation to breaking rules, the gym is not a place for picking up girls. The gym is a place for personal development, for you to transform your physical body into the best specimen version that it can be. The gym is a place not even for meeting other men. It's a place for, you might call it some form of recovery of the mind, where you break down the body and rebuild the body. Now, if you meet people in the gym, it shouldn't be a place where you focus on meeting people. It should be a place whereby you meet people, and that becomes almost an addendum, a benefit of you achieving a goal. Bars are not places where you go specifically to pursue women. I would even advise against picking up women in bars or clubs or restaurants. Now, let me give you a good example. I dance, and I always made it a point of reference that if I went to a Cuban salsa bar or a bar where there was some merengue, bachata, or kizomba, that I was there to dance. Now, even when I was still single, I would go and dance, and I would leave on my own. I would go with my friends, I would go alone sometimes, but I would always leave on my own. I dance, I move on, because the purpose was to dance. The purpose was to socialize. The purpose was not to go to pick up women. And so, I I separated two things: my desire for sex or for sexual encounters with the purpose for such venues. And by separating both, I seldom broke my rules. When you go out to socialize, go out to socialize. And my recommendation is usually use it as an opportunity to meet other men. I learned this some years ago, and I guess the experience that stood out for me the most was I was in Marbella with a friend, a male friend, and we'd taken a holiday. We sat down in a lovely restaurant and we were eating, and there was someone else on the other table, two other guys. One was much older, one was about our age group. And so we struck up a conversation. We exchanged numbers. Now, I can tell you that friendship became one of the most important cornerstones of my life, because both of us, he was the other table, they were there for business. We exchanged numbers. About 6 months later, we met him in his where he lived he lived in the Nordics. So we met him because we had visited there, and we became friends. Now, recognize this: I met a stranger in a part of Spain and it's where you would normally meet a lot of women. I was there with a friend, a male friend, and we were having dinner. The other two men were there and they were having dinner. For some reason, our paths crossed again, and we became extremely close friends. So close that every single Christmas, he insisted that I spend Christmas with him and his family. Now, what's the purpose of all of this journey or this story? The point was to say, the four of us valued the importance of the brotherhood, the importance of staying connected as men. I would say this, and I say this unashamedly: I have never met another man, and I'm referring to the older gentleman, who I gleaned more wisdom from in relation to how to behave with other men as I did from this relationship. Initially, when we started, you might call it spending more time together, I initially thought he was gay. He wasn't. The reason I had that impression was because the amount of money he spent every time we met up or we were together, the amount of resources he put into that union, the time he put aside, the sacrifices he made, initially caused me to think that this was perhaps a man who found myself and my friend attractive and was trying to, I guess, play the game. But he wasn't. What I learned was something very valuable, which is that, and in his words, most of his success came from being open to be of service to other men, meeting people and not thinking about what he would gain from them, but thinking about how he could make an experience with them a memorable experience. And so he always went out of his way. If he met people and he felt a connection with them, he made an effort to make the experience memorable. I took that lesson, and it changed how I started to treat most people I meet today. Most of my friends will tell you, if I come across an idea, business, or where you can make money, I'm always thinking about, hey, can you come into this deal? I found something, can you join? And the reason is simply because of what I learned from another older man. This is a much older man than myself. In other words, he taught me how to serve other men. Modern men today are losing that brotherhood, that connection between themselves and other men because they're too focused on sex and women. They're not focused on the future. Most young men I see today, and I've asked so many of them, the simple question: can you name 6 people who you would consider to be within your board of directors, people you can call and ask any question to, and you can trust their judgment with some level of certainty? Do you have that? Now, most people I know always say no. One of that is reasons for that is because most of them usually have friends within their age group. And let me go back to the whole idea of actually not breaking the rules. When you go out, you should socialize with men. Look for a way to pair bond with other men. Ideally, look for men who are older than you because they're usually wiser than you, all things remaining equal. The more people you have within your circle of influence, and the more wise they are, the better your decisions long term. So always keep that in mind. Now let me come back to this whole concept of being indifferent towards sex and women. Many years ago, and I'm sure many people will relate to this, I was raised and I was taught that if you're going to an event, an occasion where they'll serve food, you should always eat before you go out, so that when you get to the venue, you do what you're supposed to do, and you do the most important thing, which is to socialize. A number of times I've made a mistake of not following that advice. So I get there and I'm very hungry, and I spend most of my time stuffing my face, and then I lose out on the opportunity to socialize and interact with people. So I was taught, eat before you go to the venue, so when you get there, you don't act or you don't come across as someone who is hungry and who has only come for food. Let's, I guess, flip that on its head and say, today, a lot of young men, when you go out to the gym, or when you go out to social venues, bars and clubs and restaurants where there are beautiful women, most of you act as though you haven't eaten before you arrived. And so you're almost obsessed, you're almost poisoned, almost possessed by the need for the female validation, which you hope will lead to the copulation and sex. The best way I can tell you to minimize that risk is to go back to the first point I made earlier, or the second point I made earlier, which had to do with the conveyor belt. I've said to a few female friends, you want to keep your man happy, keep his balls empty, keep his belly full, and keep the environment in a serene state. Now think about that. If you're getting enough tail, when you go out and you're socializing, you will not be obsessed about sex. The reason being, your belly is full, your balls are empty, and you've come from a serene place. There's almost a confidence and aura about you as a man, whereby you're not necessarily looking to be, you don't come across as being desperate. That is one thing that you can do, in addition to the others that I've shared so far, in how you keep the aura of desperation that most men do not realize that they exude. Sometimes it's quite synonymous with animals and heat. Women can smell it from a distance. Whereas if you have this confidence, sometimes people call it arrogance, but it's not arrogance. It's self-assurance, it's self-confidence, it's self-esteem. Is that you know what you have. And someone once said to me, or said something that I heard through someone before, and just remember this: some will, some won't. So what? Next. Some will, some won't. So what? Next. SWSWSON. That attitude of saying, well, some won't, some will. So what? next. The next means simply, I go back to my conveyor belt. And that means that the aura of desperation is put aside. I have an indifference in terms of my attitude. And therefore, even when I meet people, this is perhaps one of the most important things I can say. Women want to be treated respectfully, with dignity. Women recognize, and they're quite smart. They know what the game of dating is all about. They know that the purpose for dating for a man is usually sex. But they do not want to be treated as though they're a piece of meat. And all you care about is eating the meat. You know, they like to be heard and understood and communicated with without the explicit intention of sex. In order for you to be interested, as they say, you have to be interested in the person. And that means if you have an aura of indifference, you can simply put sex aside completely and go into the conversation from a social perspective, whereby the end game is not to get in between her pants. The end game is simply to have a good experience, to enjoy each other's company at that point in time, not based on where you think you can, or you could be later on in the day or later on that week. Now, let me bring this to a close and simply say this. Women have an attraction to wherever men congregate. Men of power, men of influence, men of means, men who have wealth, or men who are respected by other men. And this is partly why if you go to some of the best parts of any city, what you find is the best bars, the best restaurants, the best gyms, where you find the most attractive men across any of the derivatives of things I've referred to: influence, power, fame, success, money, respect. Women congregate around such places. The most attractive women congregate around such places because women follow successful men, and they follow men who are focused, and men who have, empires in their mind. And this simply means that what you should do, whilst you replace the current attitude you have towards sex with indifference, you should actually replace the subconscious desire you have in your heart to please a woman with a desire to please other men. Your focus should be to be applauded by men. Men who are respected, men of means, men who are influential, men of good character, men with integrity. You should seek to be applauded by such men, to be acknowledged by such men, to be affirmed by such men, to be invited into more associations by such men. That should be your focus. And here is something I can promise you, that when you do that, you will not have to pursue women. And the reason will be because all of your energy will be towards creativity and helping the group. By helping the group, you will be invited to places where very few men have the opportunity to congregate, but by being exposed into that association, one of the benefits would be you'll be exposed to the most beautiful, the most intelligent, the most desirable women who will be attracted to you even without you pursuing them earnestly.